Midwest Whitetail is brought to you by Real Tree, Hoyt Archery, Muddy Outdoors, Fuse Accessories, Trophy Rock, Frigid Forage, Scott Archery, Cabela's, Rocket Broadheads, Woods Zero Turn Mowers, Bloodsport Arrows, Redneck Hunting Blinds, Scentmaster, Yeti Coolers, ScentLock, and Nikon.
Thanks for joining me today on Midwest Whitetail Off Season. On today's episode, I'm going to dive into the subject of creating permanent habitat. And I've got a project here today where I have to plant trees, basically. And I've selected silver maple, swamp white oak, black walnut, and I think I've got some wild plum in there also. It's a low-lying area, so I had to select trees that would do well in moist conditions. And this is part of a CRP contract. This is a wetland CRP, and as a part of that, you can either plant it to, I believe, switchgrass and various warm season options, or you can go to something like this, which is a tree planting. And I selected the trees for a couple of different reasons. The first and foremost reason is because long term you can actually produce some income from a forested area. So I'm taking these acres, which basically were too wet to farm. We had some CRP history with it, so we're able to get it back into the wetland CRP. And now with planting, especially the silver maple, as fast as they will grow, within 20 to 25 years, maybe 30 years, you can take a cutting off here. This program is set up for 15 years, and typically these have been pretty aggressively pursued by the government, so this should be a renewable program. So I get paid every year for the CRP contract for taking these acres out of production, and then at the end of the program, in theory at least, I should have some marketable timber here. The other reason I like the trees is because it does create a permanent habitat for hunting out of. And there's other ways you can do that, and we're going to dive into all of those ways in today's episode. But like I said, one way is what we're doing today, and that's to plant the trees, plant the seedlings. We've got a tree planter here. There's a tractor that's set up with the tree planter on it, and I've got, I think I've got 600 trees per acre for 7 acres, 4,200 trees that we've got to put in the ground today. So we'll show you that process, and then I also want to talk about the other options that you have for creating permanent habitat. The main option that I've pursued here has been timber stand improvement. And you can take an open timber that's essentially worthless for white-tailed deer. People think that a nice, beautiful, open timber is great habitat, but it really isn't, because unless there's something falling out of the trees for the deer to eat, there's no browse on the forest floor. Basically, a deer can starve in a timber like that. We've had a lot of that kind of timber on this farm with hickory ridges, a fair amount of elm and some other type trees like that, some locust thickets. Basically, over the past 12 years or so, we've gone through and we've just cleaned all those areas right out. And by saying that, I mean we cut those trees down, and that opens up the canopy and lets sunlight hit the forest floor. Then you can get regeneration in a whole bunch of different types of species that are more beneficial. You're either going to get something that potentially has some timber value, maybe an oak regeneration, potentially you could get a little bit of walnut regeneration if you've got some seed trees around. But the main reason that I do it on this farm is for the habitat improvement and for the improvement in the browse. And we've done a fair amount over the years of profiling how you do timber stand improvement, and some of the details on dropping the trees versus frilling the trees and squirting Tordon in there. I'm in favor of dropping the trees. I like to have the tops on the ground. You get instant cover. I also don't want a whole bunch of dead trees sitting in my timber just waiting to fall either on a tree stand or who knows. I just don't want a bunch of those widowmakers, if you want to call it that, sitting out there in the timber. Some people like the hinge cut, where you make a partial cut, the tree falls, but it's not cut all the way through. So now you've got a tree that's growing horizontally. And there's some reasons for that. That makes a lot of sense. You get a lot of ground level cover very quickly that way, because you don't have to get that flush of vegetation coming up. That tree will basically continue to stay alive and continue to put out leaves and fill in that area at ground level. So anyway, timber stand improvement is one option. We targeted the non-timber value trees on this property. We really tried to protect and release the oaks, the walnuts, the maples. Last point on timber stand improvement, that's basically a winter project because what you want to do is kill the tree, and when you cut it off at ground level, you want to be able to spray the stump or squirt Tordon on that stump or some other tree killer. And if the tree is growing actively, it's pushing so much sap up that a lot of times you don't get a really good kill if you try to do it during the spring. And then you end up with all these little shoots and suckers and stuff coming off that tree, off that stump. And for my purposes, I want those trees dead once we cut them down. Okay, so let's move on to the next type of permanent habitat, and that is direct nut seeding. And I've spent a lot of time on some of the episodes through the years talking about the direct nut seeding projects that we've done on this farm. In fact, we've got one right here in this field. The upper part of the field was direct nut seeded back in 2007. This was not a super productive site. This one didn't do really well compared to some of the other spots on the farm. I think it's just really the poor quality of the soil here. This got farmed for many years before I bought this farm, and I think that side hill just got so eroded that there's not much left in there of decent quality topsoil. But on some of the sites that we've done the direct nut seeding, back in 2007, 2008, I think 9, I think we did another one in 11. And we've got trees that are waist high or better and real thick, a very successful planting. And I guess I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about exactly how you do a direct nut seeding. You can go back through some of the past episodes. And direct nut seeding really involves creating a nice seed bed, almost like you're going to plant corn. Then you go in there and you distribute. We use hand distribution of the acorns. You can do walnuts that way. I mean, we've done maple with direct nut seeding as well. So you get all the seed, nicely distributed out over the soil. And there's a plan of course, how many acorns per acre, how many pounds of maple, whirly birds, or how many walnut, bushels of walnut per acre. And there's all kinds of information about that. And rather than diving into a whole lot of specifics on this episode, I really want to talk about the concept. Spread the seed out, come back after you get the seed out and disc it under, and do a real light disking. You don't want to bury it too deep, a couple inches, anywhere from, your distribution of seed should be anywhere from about 3 inches to the surface. The stuff on the surface isn't going to do real well, especially if you've got acorns, because the squirrels and the turkeys and the deer are going to pick those off. But you should get a nice even distribution from your 3.5 or 3 inches up to your top level. And that stuff, we do it in the fall, we do it in October. White oaks germinate in the fall, so you want to make sure that you're getting them in the ground just as soon as they hit the ground, because they're not going to overwinter the way that red oaks and bur oaks will. Ideally, you have a rain that comes in right after you do your direct seeding. That's one option. The reason I like that versus planting seedlings is you can swamp the area with small trees. If you plant seedlings, as you'll see today, we've got all these little rows of trees. It's easy for a deer just to walk down that row and nip the top off each one, or nip the top off 10 of them, and then another deer comes along and nips the top off 10 more. Whereas if you plant tens of thousands of acorns in the ground, you're going to get a lot more oak or a lot more of the other tree species too, because you can just basically swamp the deer with so much coming up that they can't stay ahead of all of it. And then eventually you can come back and you can select out the poor ones, and you can cut them out and make room for the better trees to continue to grow well. So that's direct nut seeding. I like that method of creating permanent habitat. We've done probably, I'm going to say probably 30 some, maybe 40, maybe pushing 40 acres of direct nut seeding on this farm over the years. I'd say 90% of those sites have done really well. The other 10% are usually poor soil quality. The next method is planting something like switchgrass or a warm season grass, where you've got habitat that's basically shoulder high. And I think we've got 15 or 20 acres like that on this farm. And I know there are people who really like that as a habitat choice. I've not had much success with it here. So as a long-term permanent habitat, not a big lover of the switchgrass, but you can establish it fairly quickly, and it's something that, like I said, some people really like it, and I suppose in areas where the deer don't have any other options of places to live, that switchgrass is probably going to work for them. Then the other method that I've used is actually moving trees. And this location, coming back to that again now, in this location starting in 2008, I think, I started clearing all of the small trees out of this bottom and moving them up onto the side hill. And also there's a thicket of cedars in front of me, real nice, pretty thicket. These were, I think I moved 80 to 90 cedar trees out of the bottom, which at that time I had the intention of farming the bottom. Get those trees out of there, move them up in the area where I knew I wasn't going to farm because the soil was too poor. And I got lucky that year, and we moved everything a day before a big rain. I think we had almost 100% survival on those moved trees. And we were moving some pretty big cedars too. I'd say, some of them are probably 10 to 12 feet tall. That way, it's not something that you're going to be able to do a lot of because you can't move trees a long distance. But if you've got some spots where you're trying to clean them up for whatever reason, rather than cut those trees down, you get the tree spade. We pulled it with a tractor, and that was a pretty smooth operation. It worked really well. So those are the 4 methods that I can see. Of those 4 methods, I like timber stand improvement best. Creates quick habitat with regeneration, a lot of browse. It also makes the ground floor real thick so that you can get to and from your tree stands without being seen, so your farm actually hunts bigger. My second priority would be direct nut seeding, which we've done a lot of and seen some nice success with. My third method is going to be what we're doing today by planting the seedlings. For me, fourth would be moving trees, and I'm leaving my poor switchgrass for last because that's not one that I really care for that much here. So anyway, let's dive into getting these trees in the ground, and hopefully I haven't bored you with too much talk about creating habitat here, but it's a subject that a lot of people ask about, and I think everybody's trying to find ways to make their properties better. And one of the ways you can do that is to take areas like this that really aren't farmable and converting those into permanent habitat. One of the keys to getting good survival when you're planting trees like this is to make sure that the roots on the trees stay wet until you stick them in the ground. And our soil here is going to be really moist, so once we get them in, I'm not worried about them droughting out down here. But you don't want to have any kind of a survival issue resulting from the roots drying out before you plant them. So this one's got a little tub, this tree planter. We're going to fill that up with water. Every time we take a couple bags of trees, we're going to set them right straight into that water as soon as they come out of the plastic bags. Then they're ready to go to drop into the dirt. Another one is you want to make sure that you pack the soil in around the tree when you plant it. Because you don't want any air pockets to get in there, because once again, that's going to result in the roots drying out and the tree dying. Jared and I have got a bunch more trees to get into the ground, but I'm going to go ahead and let Luke take off and go into the office and get started working on the show. We'll keep working on putting the trees in, but got one more segment I wanted to throw at you this week that I thought was interesting. Anytime you own land like this, you're going to have the odd project. And this past week we had to fix a crossing that the farmer had used going into one of my best food plots. And he had been pulling behind the anhydrous applicator in a tank and got stuck in there and tore it up. So we're going to leave you here with just a little segment on the process of fixing a crossing using equipment like this Cabela's. I guess I used the LM50 tractor and a rear blade and a front bucket. Stuff like this is always coming up. It's nice to have equipment on the farm where you can handle it. You can get a lot of work done with small equipment if you're just patient. Well, that's it for this week. I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Midwest Whitetail. And remember to always dream big.